Positano, Italy, June 9, 2023. Michael Reeves, a 52-year-old American entrepreneur, was found dead in the guest house of his luxury villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident soon raised suspicions, prompting authorities to take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding his death. Michael Reeves seemed to have it all. His sprawling villa perched high above the shimmering waters of the Amalfi Coast, offering breathtaking views that rivaled the most exclusive resorts in Italy. He had built an empire in the tech industry, allowing him and his wife, Julia, to enjoy the kind of life most could only dream of: luxury cars, high-end parties, and an ever-growing social circle of fellow expats and Italian elites. To the outside world, they embodied perfection. Julia, 10 years younger than Michael, played her role flawlessly. She was the charming hostess, always impeccably dressed, her laughter floating effortlessly through the air at every event they attended. She had embraced the Italian lifestyle with open arms, immersing herself in charity work, art galas, and exclusive luncheons with other wealthy wives. But beneath the polished surface, something was missing. Michael was always busy, constantly traveling for business and attending meetings that stretched long into the night. At first, Julia accepted it as part of their glamorous life. Success required sacrifice, she reminded herself. But over time, the absences grew longer, the conversations shorter, and the space between them widened in ways she couldn't quite understand. Michael, on the other hand, was restless. The Amalfi Coast, despite its beauty, had begun to feel suffocating. He thrived on excitement, the thrill of the chase, the constant pursuit of something new. Julia, though beautiful and intelligent, had become part of the routine, predictable and too familiar. It was during one of his visits to a small, tucked-away gallery in Positano that he met Francesca Moretti, a local art dealer with an undeniable charm. Francesca, in her early 30s, was everything Julia was not: spontaneous, passionate, and free-spirited. She had an effortless beauty about her, with long dark hair and a soft Italian accent that made every conversation feel like a flirtation. What started as small talk over a painting soon became something more. She was intrigued by Michael's wealth and power, and he was captivated by her intoxicating presence. Their meetings were innocent at first, discussions about art, late afternoon espressos overlooking the coast. But with each encounter, the lines blurred, and before long, they found themselves entangled in something far beyond casual flirtation. Michael was drawn to Francesca's carefree attitude, a stark contrast to the structured life he shared with Julia. Julia, oblivious to the affair, continued to fill her days with social obligations and philanthropic events. She had become well known in the expat community for organizing high-profile charity auctions and dinners, earning her a reputation as a sophisticated and generous woman. Friends often commented on how perfect her life seemed, and she would smile, playing along with the illusion she had grown used to maintaining. Yet, deep down, there was a nagging feeling she couldn't quite shake. Michael had become distant, not in the obvious way that would raise alarms, but in the small details. He no longer asked about her day, no longer reached for her hand absent-mindedly during their evening walks, and his eyes seemed to drift elsewhere during their candlelit dinners. Some of their friends noticed too. Whispers circulated through the close-knit expat community, observations made in hushed tones over glasses of wine. It wasn't unusual for men like Michael, successful, wealthy, and living in a foreign country, to seek out local women. And Francesca, with her striking beauty and effortless charm, was hard to ignore. But in a world where discretion was valued above all else, no one dared to say anything to Julia directly. Julia, unaware of the growing rumors, remained devoted to her marriage, convinced that their busy schedules were the only thing causing the growing distance. She often told herself that once Michael's latest project was wrapped up, things would return to normal. Michael, meanwhile, was becoming more reckless. Secret rendezvous with Francesca became more frequent, hidden in plain sight among the bustling cafes and hidden coastal hideaways. Each stolen moment felt like an escape from the mundane, and with every encounter, he grew more entangled in her world. Francesca, eager to secure a place in Michael's life beyond stolen afternoons, started pressing him about their future. whether he saw a life with her beyond the affair. Despite the mounting risks, Michael couldn't bring himself to walk away. Francesca offered him something Julia never could: excitement, spontaneity, and a reminder of his younger self. Yet, there was a part of him that still clung to the stability Julia provided, the life they had built together over decades. Unbeknownst to him, his double life was becoming harder to conceal. Francesca's presence in the local social scene was growing, and their discreet meetings were no longer going unnoticed. Julia's friends, though polite, began to suspect that Michael's frequent absences had less to do with business and more to do with something, or someone else. Still, Julia remained blind to it, unwilling to see the truth even as it crept closer with each passing day. She continued hosting dinner parties, attending charity events, and smiling for photos, all while the foundations of her marriage were slowly eroding beneath her. For now, Michael's secret remained intact, but the delicate balance he had so carefully maintained was beginning to shift. The whispers were getting louder, and the facade of their perfect life was starting to crack. The Amalfi Coast had always been a place of romance, beauty, and luxury. But beneath its breathtaking exterior, secrets festered in the shadows, waiting for the moment they would finally come to light. The affair between Michael and Francesca grew in intensity with each passing day, woven into the fabric of the Amalfi Coast's idyllic scenery. Their secret meetings played out like a carefully orchestrated dance: stolen moments at Francesca's small art gallery, whispered conversations over glasses of wine in quiet seaside cafes, and long afternoons spent hidden away in private coastal retreats, far from prying eyes. Michael thrived on the secrecy, the thrill of sneaking around, the excitement that came with living a double life. He found himself making excuses to stay longer in Italy, attending business meetings that never existed and inventing pressing obligations that required his attention. His schedule, once predictable and structured, became erratic. Julia, ever the supportive wife, accepted his explanations at first, convincing herself that his sudden restlessness was simply the burden of a man juggling too many responsibilities. But slowly, cracks began to form. Michael started missing their usual dinners at their favorite cliffside restaurant, offering vague excuses that never quite added up. He grew distant in their conversations, distracted and impatient, his phone always within reach. Julia noticed the way he avoided eye contact, how he hesitated before answering simple questions. She tried not to let it bother her, choosing to believe that work stress was simply taking a toll. Francesca, on the other hand, was becoming more demanding. What had started as an exciting affair was no longer enough for her. She was growing tired of being the hidden mistress, tucked away in the background while Michael returned to his beautiful wife and their luxurious villa. She wanted more: promises, commitment, a future. Michael, however, was hesitant. "Leave her," Francesca whispered one evening, tracing her fingers along the rim of her wine glass as they sat in the dimly lit corner of a small restaurant in Positano. "We could have a life together, Michael. No more sneaking around." Michael smiled, offering her the same charming reassurances he always did. "Francesca, it's not that simple," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You know how complicated things are." But Francesca was growing impatient. She had invested too much time and emotion into their relationship to remain a secret forever. She wanted to be more than an escape. Meanwhile, back at the villa, Julia began noticing small but unsettling changes. There were credit card charges from places Michael never mentioned, boutique purchases she didn't recognize, and the faint, unfamiliar scent of expensive perfume on his clothes. His once predictable habits were shifting: late-night calls, sudden trips to town, and an emotional distance that couldn't be ignored. Julia confided in her closest friend, Isabella Romano, over lunch at a quiet cafe overlooking the marina. Isabella had been part of their social circle for years, a confidant who had seen the ups and downs of their marriage from the outside. "You know how men are," Isabella said, stirring her espresso. "Maybe it's just a phase, work stress, or something like that." Julia nodded, forcing a smile, but Isabella leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "But if you ask me, I've heard things. Whispers. Michael's been seen with a woman in town. A local. Julia froze, the weight of Isabella's words pressing down on her. "It's probably just business," she said quickly, shaking her head, as if saying it aloud would make it true. People love to gossip. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Julia couldn't ignore it. She started watching Michael more closely, analyzing his every move, searching for signs she had previously ignored. Back in town, the whispers had already begun to circulate. The Amalfi Coast was a place of beauty and discretion, but in a tight-knit community like theirs, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The locals had noticed Michael's visits to Francesca's gallery becoming more frequent, and his presence at secluded beach villas didn't go unnoticed either. Townsfolk whispered over morning espressos and exchanged knowing glances when they saw Michael with Francesca in places they shouldn't have been. Michael, for all his attempts to keep things quiet, was losing control of the situation. Julia's questions were growing sharper, Francesca's demands were becoming louder, and the town's quiet whispers were turning into cautious stares. One evening, Julia decided to test Michael. She mentioned a dinner event they had planned weeks ago, one he had mysteriously forgotten. "You remember, don't you? The fundraiser at the yacht club?" she asked, watching him closely. Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Of course I do," he said, but Julia could tell he was lying. That night, as he disappeared into his study for yet another urgent call, Julia sat alone on their terrace, staring out at the endless sea, feeling the weight of suspicion settle in her chest. She told herself she was being paranoid, but deep down, something told her otherwise. Meanwhile, Francesca grew bolder. She started sending Michael messages at odd hours, pressing him for more time together, more reassurance. "I can't keep waiting forever," she wrote one afternoon, her frustration mounting. Michael knew he was treading dangerous waters, but the allure of Francesca was too strong. He promised himself he would find a way to manage the situation, to balance his responsibilities without losing control. But with each lie he told Julia and each promise he made to Francesca, the walls were closing in. The affair, once thrilling and spontaneous, was becoming a burden. Julia, despite her growing suspicions, still clung to hope. She wanted to believe that Michael was the man she had married all those years ago, that their life in Italy wasn't built on lies. But with every passing day, the truth became harder to ignore. The Amalfi Coast, with its picture-perfect views and romantic charm, had become the backdrop for a betrayal that was slowly unraveling the perfect life Julia thought she had. The illusion of a perfect life was beginning to crumble. Julia had always trusted Michael, but the subtle changes in his behavior gnawed at the back of her mind like an unwelcome intruder. It started with the little things, the missed dinners, the hurried phone calls, and the distracted looks he gave her when she spoke. Then, one afternoon while sorting through a pile of mail, she found a credit card statement tucked between travel brochures. The total made her pause. Scrolling through the list of charges, Julia's eyes narrowed. There were purchases from high-end boutiques in Positano and a luxury spa in Capri, places Michael never mentioned. And then, the most telling sign of all, a jewelry store she had never stepped foot in. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't received anything from Michael in months, and she knew better than to believe he was suddenly shopping for surprises. She didn't confront him right away. Instead, she tucked the statement into a drawer, forcing herself to stay composed. But doubt had already crept in, and it refused to leave. Meanwhile, Michael was beginning to feel the weight of his double life. The affair with Francesca, which once felt like a thrilling escape, was now turning into something far more complicated. Francesca had started pushing for more time, more promises, more certainty. But Michael, despite all the whispered assurances, knew he could never fully walk away from Julia and the life they had built. He became distant with Francesca, canceling plans and making excuses, retreating to his work in an effort to avoid difficult conversations. Francesca sensed the shift immediately. Gone were the spontaneous weekend getaways and stolen afternoons at her gallery. Now, their meetings felt rushed and secretive, as though he were slipping through her fingers. Desperation took hold. One evening, she confided in her sister, Julia, over a quiet dinner at a coastal cafe. "You're playing a dangerous game," Julia warned, her tone cautious yet firm. Men like Michael don't leave their wives. You're just a moment for him. Francesca shook her head, unwilling to accept that. He loves me, she insisted, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. I know he does. Julia sighed. Francesca, these affairs, especially with wealthy foreigners, they rarely end well. Be careful. But Francesca wouldn't hear it. She was too deep in, too invested in the fantasy of a life with Michael. Back at the villa, Julia's paranoia had begun to take root. She watched Michael more closely, noticing how his phone never left his side and how he stepped out onto the terrace to take calls he didn't want her to overhear. One night, curiosity got the best of her. As he slipped outside, she followed quietly, standing just beyond the patio doors. She could hear his hushed voice, words she couldn't make out, but the affectionate tone was unmistakable. When he ended the call and turned to go inside, Julia rushed back to her seat, her heart racing. Driven by suspicion, Julia made a bold decision. One evening, after Michael announced he was heading to a late dinner with business associates, she decided to follow him. Keeping her distance, she trailed his car along the winding coastal roads, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. But Michael, whether by instinct or habit, proved too elusive. He took unexpected turns and changed directions, finally stopping at a small hotel in Ravello. Julia, not wanting to be seen, parked at a distance, watching as he disappeared inside. She waited for nearly an hour, staring at the glowing entrance, hoping she was wrong. But deep down, she already knew the truth. At their next social gathering, Julia felt the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. Surrounded by the usual crowd of wealthy expats and local socialites, she watched Michael closely, observing how he interacted with their friends. Everything about their glamorous lifestyle, the fine wine, the laughter, the effortless charm, felt like an elaborate lie. She caught herself studying the faces of the women in the room, wondering if one of them knew more than they were letting on. Michael, sensing Julia's coldness, grew defensive. He could feel her eyes on him, the shift in her demeanor. He brushed off her pointed remarks with forced laughter, but inside, he felt trapped. The walls of his carefully constructed world were closing in. Later that evening, as they drove back to their villa in silence, Julia turned to him and asked, "Are you happy, Michael?" He hesitated for a split second before answering. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" Julia forced a smile and looked out at the darkened coastline, feeling the answer she was looking for in his hesitation. Meanwhile, Francesca was growing restless. She longed for the nights when Michael would hold her close and whisper promises of a future together. But lately, he had been distant. Short replies to her messages, excuses about work, and a clear reluctance to meet as often as they once did. She feared she was losing him. One afternoon, unable to contain her frustration, Francesca showed up unannounced at Michael's office in Salerno. The receptionist, who recognized her immediately, hesitated before letting her through. When Francesca confronted Michael, he looked startled, glancing nervously around the office before pulling her into a private room. "You can't just show up like this," he whispered harshly. Francesca's eyes welled with tears. "I can't keep doing this, Michael. I need to know where we stand." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just need time, Francesca. I'll figure things out." But Francesca was no longer willing to wait. As Julia continued piecing together the unsettling signs, receipts, whispered calls, and Michael's growing distance, her suspicions turned into certainty. She wasn't ready to confront him yet, but she knew something was terribly wrong. The once glamorous life they shared, filled with champagne toasts and sunset boat rides, now felt like a fragile illusion, and Julia could sense that the truth would soon come crashing down. Julia had suspected it for weeks, but nothing could have prepared her for the moment when her worst fears were confirmed. It happened late one evening, when Michael thought she was asleep. She had gotten up for a glass of water and was heading back to the bedroom when she heard his voice drifting through the slightly ajar study door. She paused, standing in the dimly lit hallway, heart pounding. Michael's voice was low, tense. "I just need a little more time," he was saying. "I promise, I'll figure things out soon." Julia's breath caught in her throat. There was a long silence on the other end of the call, and then Michael sighed heavily. "I know, Francesca. I know." Julia's fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. The truth hung in the air like a weight she could no longer ignore. She didn't need to hear any more. She turned and walked back to the bedroom, her mind racing. The next morning, Julia moved through the house in a daze. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage had crumbled in an instant. But instead of confronting Michael in a fit of anger, she made a decision. She needed proof. Real proof. Proof that would leave no room for doubt or denial. Within days, she had quietly hired a private investigator, Lorenzo DeSantis, a discreet local known for his work with wealthy clients dealing with marital troubles. Sitting across from him in a quiet cafe far from the prying eyes of their social circle, Julia handed him a recent photo of Michael. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Where he goes, who he's with." Lorenzo nodded, sliding the photo into his folder. "I'll be discreet. You'll have what you need soon." Days passed in agonizing silence. Julia played her role perfectly, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while beneath the surface, she was unraveling. She hosted friends for lunch, attended charity events, and even shared polite conversations with Michael over breakfast. But inside, her thoughts were consumed by what Lorenzo might uncover. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived at their villa, slipped discreetly under the door. Julia waited until she was alone before opening it. Inside were photographs, grainy but damning. Michael and Francesca at a seaside hotel, their hands lingering too long, their smiles too familiar. Another photo showed them walking through town, heads close together in conversation. Julia stared at the images, feeling a sharp, twisting pain in her chest. There it was. Proof. A part of her had still been holding on to hope that she was wrong, that she had misinterpreted the signs. But there was no denying it now. That night, Julia sat on their bedroom balcony, the photographs in her lap. The anger she had expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, a cold, calculated determination settled over her. She would not let this humiliation break her. Instead of confronting Michael with accusations and emotional outbursts, she chose a different path. She would wait, watch, and see how far he was willing to go. Michael, oblivious to Julia's newfound awareness, continued his charade, thinking his secrets were still safe. But Julia saw through it all now. The way he left the room to take calls, the sudden need for last-minute meetings, the lingering scent of perfume on his clothes. Francesca, on the other hand, was growing restless. The affair, which had once been thrilling and full of excitement, had now become a source of frustration. She was tired of being hidden away, tired of Michael's excuses. Late one evening, as they sat in the secluded corner of a beachside restaurant, Francesca leaned in, her voice low but firm. "I can't keep doing this, Michael," she said. "You promised me things would change." Michael shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I just need more time, Francesca. Julia's been difficult lately." Francesca's expression hardened. "Difficult? Or do you just not want to leave her?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't have an answer for that. He loved Francesca, or at least he thought he did. But leaving Julia? That was an entirely different reality, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Julia observed him closely over the following weeks. Every glance at his phone, every unexplained outing, every nervous gesture. He thought he was hiding it well, but Julia saw everything. One evening, as Michael prepared for yet another business dinner, Julia watched him from the doorway. "You're working late again?" she asked casually, her tone light. Michael nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. "Yeah, just some last-minute deals. You know how it is." Julia smiled faintly, leaning against the doorframe. "Of course. Don't work too hard." He gave her a distracted kiss on the cheek and hurried out the door. The moment he was gone, Julia's expression hardened. She knew exactly where he was going. The tension in their household grew heavier with each passing day. Julia's quiet observation made Michael uneasy. He noticed how she no longer pressed him with questions, how she seemed too accommodating, too accepting. It should have been a relief, but instead, it made him nervous. He caught himself watching her from across the room, wondering if she knew more than she was letting on. Francesca, unaware of Julia's growing awareness, continued pushing Michael. Her demands became more frequent, her frustration more evident. She wanted a future with him, and Michael was running out of ways to stall. "I need an answer, Michael," Francesca said during one of their secret meetings. "I won't wait forever." But Michael was trapped. He couldn't bring himself to leave Julia, yet he couldn't walk away from Francesca either. Julia, on the other hand, was already planning her next move. She knew confrontation would come, but it would be on her terms. And when it did, Michael wouldn't see it coming. For now, she waited, watching him spin his web of lies, knowing that sooner or later, it would all come crashing down. The atmosphere in the Reeves' luxurious villa had shifted. Julia moved through the grand halls with a quiet, unsettling calm, one that Michael couldn't quite place. At first, he had dismissed it as a passing mood, attributing her cold demeanor to stress or boredom. But soon, the sharp, passive-aggressive remarks started. "You must be exhausted from all those late meetings," she'd say over breakfast, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't know how you keep up." Michael would glance up from his coffee, forcing a smile, but inside, he felt a slow churn of anxiety. He found himself fumbling through answers, growing increasingly cautious of his every move. Each time Julia pressed him with seemingly innocent questions, he could sense the unspoken tension behind them. "Did you ever make it to that meeting in Ravello last week?" Julia asked one evening, swirling the wine in her glass. "I thought I saw your car heading towards Positano instead." Michael stiffened. "Must have been someone else," he muttered too quickly. He laughed nervously, but Julia only smiled in return, saying nothing. The walls were closing in on him, and he knew it. At the same time, Francesca was growing desperate. The thrill of their secret affair had long since been overshadowed by frustration and uncertainty. She had tolerated the late-night rendezvous and the whispered promises of a future, but her patience was wearing thin. One evening, at her gallery, Francesca finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore, Michael," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Either you leave her, or I walk away for good." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Francesca, you have to understand." "No," she interrupted, stepping closer, her eyes burning with frustration. "I've been understanding. I've been patient, but I won't be your secret anymore." Michael knew she meant it. Francesca was not the type of woman to wait around forever, and the thought of losing her terrified him. But leaving Julia? That was an entirely different conversation, one he wasn't ready to have. Meanwhile, Julia's rage simmered beneath the surface. She confided in her closest friend, Isabella, over lunch at a quiet seaside cafe. Julia's voice was low, but filled with fury as she detailed the affair and Michael's deceit. "I trusted him," Julia said, her hands trembling around her cup, "and he made a fool of me." Isabella, ever the pragmatic one, placed a reassuring hand over Julia's. "You have to stay calm, Julia. Think this through. Don't do anything rash." Julia nodded, but the storm inside her wouldn't settle. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, confronting him, leaving him, even revenge. She wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. There was something about the humiliation of it all that made her want to make Michael suffer the way she had. As the days passed, Michael grew more distant, spending longer hours away from home, claiming business obligations that no longer convinced Julia. She noticed how he avoided her gaze, how he flinched slightly whenever she touched on sensitive topics. The tension between them reached its peak during a dinner party at the villa. It was an event Julia had planned weeks in advance, a gathering of their closest friends and business associates. The dining room was filled with laughter and clinking glasses, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere was strained. Julia, wearing an elegant emerald gown, sat across from Michael at the grand table. She played her part flawlessly, smiling and engaging in light conversation, but anyone paying close attention could sense the underlying chill in her interactions with her husband. "Michael," she said sweetly at one point, her voice carrying across the table, "didn't you say you were in Rome last week? I swear I saw someone who looked just like you in Positano." Michael nearly choked on his drink, clearing his throat. "Rome. Yes, of course. Must have been someone else. A knowing murmur passed through the guests, though no one dared to comment. Julia's icy tone and pointed glances were impossible to miss. More notably, Francesca was nowhere to be seen. Her absence did not go unnoticed by Julia, who had made sure the guest list was sent to all their friends, just to make a point. Michael had spent the evening sneaking anxious glances at his phone, but Francesca had kept her promise and stayed away, leaving him to stew in his own discomfort. By the time the evening wound down, Julia was certain of one thing. Michael was unraveling, and she wasn't about to let him off easily. As the last guests departed and the villa fell silent, Julia stood by the window, gazing out at the dark coastline. She heard Michael's footsteps approach but didn't turn around. "You were awfully quiet tonight," he said hesitantly, standing behind her. Julia took a slow sip of wine, finally meeting his gaze in the reflection of the glass. "I was just observing," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "It's fascinating what you can learn when you really pay attention." Michael forced a chuckle, but his face had paled. He knew she was onto him. He just didn't know how much. That night, Julia lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Michael slept beside her, oblivious. She knew Francesca was giving him ultimatums, and she knew Michael was struggling to keep the pieces of his life together. But she wasn't going to confront him, not yet. Let him squirm, let him wonder. The villa was unnervingly quiet that night. Julia sat alone in the grand living room, the glow from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room's elegant furnishings. The waves crashed rhythmically in the distance, their constant hum a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside her. A nearly empty glass of wine rested on the table beside her, next to a neat stack of damning photographs. Each image was a cruel reminder of the deception she had uncovered, a painful testament to the life she thought she knew. Michael was late. Again. Julia had spent weeks pretending not to notice his absences, smiling through gritted teeth at social gatherings, and playing the devoted wife to a man who had quietly shattered their marriage. But tonight, the waiting felt different. There was no anxious pacing or nervous glancing at the clock, just an unsettling calm that had settled over her. The truth was out, and Julia no longer felt the need to keep up the charade. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel driveway broke the stillness, pulling Julia from her thoughts. She didn't move right away, instead watching the flickering light outside as Michael's car came to a stop. The front door creaked open, and his familiar footsteps echoed through the hall. Julia remained seated, swirling the wine in her glass, staring at the photographs in front of her. Michael entered the room, loosening his tie and sighing heavily. His expression darkened when he saw her sitting there, the photos spread out before her like pieces of evidence. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that there was no more pretending. Without a word, Michael turned away, heading for the stairs, but Julia's voice stopped him. It was calm, but sharp. "We need to talk." Michael sighed, his shoulders tensing. He turned back slowly, dragging his feet as he lowered himself onto the couch opposite Julia. His eyes flickered to the images of him and Francesca, holding hands at a hotel, walking too closely along the promenade. The weight of his double life was now laid out before him, undeniable and inescapable. Julia studied him, waiting for him to speak, but he only leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Julia's face remained expressionless, but inside, a storm was brewing. Weeks of betrayal, humiliation, and anger had brought her to this moment, and she wasn't about to let him slip away with half-hearted excuses. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Michael finally muttered, running a hand through his hair. His voice was strained, tired. Julia let out a bitter laugh under her breath, shaking her head slowly. "And how exactly did you want me to find out, Michael? Or were you hoping I never would?" He sighed, rubbing his temples, avoiding her gaze. "It just happened." Julia clenched her jaw, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "No," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Things like this don't just happen. You made choices, Michael. Over and over again." Michael leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, exhaustion creeping into his features. "I never meant to hurt you," he muttered. Julia stared at him, feeling the weight of the words. How easy it was for him to say that now, after weeks of deception and lies. "But you did," she said simply, her tone devoid of emotion. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. Michael, sensing the conversation wasn't going anywhere he wanted it to, stood abruptly. "I'm too tired for this, Julia. I can't do this tonight." He turned and walked toward the back of the villa, heading for the guest house where he often retreated when he wanted space. Julia sat still, watching him go, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Moments later, she rose to her feet, setting the glass down with deliberate care. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks was now boiling over, and she wasn't going to let him walk away from this. At least, not tonight. The cool night air wrapped around her as she stepped outside, the faint sound of the sea filling the silence. The gravel crunched beneath her heels as she made her way toward the guest house, the small structure bathed in warm light against the backdrop of the dark coastline. Inside, Michael had settled onto the couch, rubbing his face with both hands. He didn't hear her enter at first, too caught up in his own thoughts. Julia stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, the weight of everything that had led them to this point pressing down on her chest. "I told you," Michael said without looking up, sensing her presence. "I need some space." Julia stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "You don't get to decide that anymore, Michael." Michael finally looked up, and something about the way Julia stood there, the controlled rage in her eyes, the way her fists were clenched at her sides, made him pause. "You ruined everything," she said quietly, "and you think you can just walk away from it?" Michael exhaled, standing up to face her. "Julia, I know you're angry, but let's not do this now." But Julia wasn't done. The weight of her humiliation, her shattered trust, and the betrayal that had festered for weeks finally broke through the surface. She took a step closer, her voice low but sharp. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Michael ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I never wanted things to end up like this. I thought we were happy." Julia's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Happy? You call lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, happy?" Michael took a deep breath, his exhaustion turning into irritation. "Look, I made a mistake, all right? But I can't fix it tonight, Julia. I need to think." Julia stood still, her heart pounding in her ears. She could feel the anger coursing through her veins, the betrayal cutting deep. But she said nothing. Finally, Michael shook his head and walked past her, retreating further into the guest house. Julia remained frozen in place, her breath shaky and uneven. The night stretched on in silence, but the weight of what had transpired lingered heavily in the air. Nothing had been resolved, and deep down, Julia knew things would never be the same again. She turned and left without another word, the distant sound of the waves echoing in her ears as she walked back to the main house, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The villa was cloaked in an eerie stillness, the distant murmur of the waves the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence. Julia sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the soft glow of the chandelier above. The untouched wine glass in front of her reflected the weight of the evening, a night she could no longer control. Michael had walked away. Again. He had stormed off to the guest house, leaving behind the wreckage of their latest confrontation, a string of half-hearted apologies and meaningless reassurances. Julia clenched her fists, staring at the empty space he had left behind. How could he treat her like this? As if she were nothing more than an inconvenience, a relic of his past life while he pursued someone new. The photographs from the private investigator lay scattered across the table, each one a stab to her already shattered heart. She traced her fingers over an image of him and Francesca, laughing, their bodies too close for comfort. The weight in her chest grew heavier. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stood, the sheer force of her emotions propelling her forward. This wasn't something she could let slide. Not this time. The night air wrapped around her like a cold embrace as she made her way across the stone pathway leading to the guest house. The soft rustle of the olive trees overhead seemed louder than usual, the wind whispering secrets only she could hear. Inside, Michael sat slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his expression dark with irritation. He barely looked up when the door opened, but when he saw Julia standing there, something shifted in his eyes, an annoyance, a weariness. "Julia, I don't have time for this," he muttered, setting his phone down, but Julia didn't move. She stood in the doorway, staring at him with a quiet intensity that made him sit up straighter. "You think you can just walk away from this?" she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Michael sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "We've been through this already. I'm done arguing with you." The words sliced through her like a blade. All the years she had given him, all the sacrifices, dismissed in a single sentence. A storm brewed inside her, years of anger and heartbreak finally reaching their peak. Julia's emotions reached a boiling point, her thoughts clouded by the weight of betrayal and anger. She could no longer hold back the storm inside her. The tension in the room crackled as Michael turned to leave, his dismissive expression fueling the fire that had been building within her for months. In the next moment, everything shifted. A sharp noise cut through the silence, and the atmosphere in the guest house grew heavy with an overwhelming stillness. Julia stood frozen, her breathing shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room seemed different now, quieter, heavier. Her gaze remained locked on the space in front of her, trying to process the reality of what had just transpired. Slowly, she stepped back, her mind racing through the consequences, yet her body moved on autopilot, wiping away any trace of the confrontation. Her breathing was ragged, her hands trembling as she smoothed down the fabric of her dress. The seconds stretched on endlessly, but Julia forced herself to focus. She had to be careful. No one could know. She glanced around the room, her sharp eyes noting everything. Michael's glass on the table, the slight misalignment of the chair he had been sitting in. With deliberate precision, she reached for a napkin and wiped the glass clean, setting it down exactly where it had been before. She walked to the door, careful not to leave any trace behind. The cool night air hit her like a wave as she stepped outside, her mind racing but her face calm. She walked back to the villa with practiced grace, her posture upright, her hands steady. The security cameras positioned around the property silently captured her return, recording the moment she stepped through the front door and into the quiet sanctuary of the house. Julia took a deep breath, closing the door behind her and locking it with a soft click. Inside, she moved methodically, pouring herself another glass of wine and settling into the plush chair by the window. She stared out into the darkness, the weight of the night pressing down on her, but her expression remained composed. The minutes ticked by, then hours. Julia sat in complete stillness, her mind replaying everything that had happened. The overwhelming mix of emotions, anger, regret, relief, swirled within her, but she forced them down. There would be time to process it later. For now, she needed to maintain control. Tomorrow, she would wake up and go about her day as if nothing had changed. The house staff would see her as they always did, poised, elegant, and in control. She would greet the neighbors, attend her charity functions, and smile in all the right places. Julia leaned back in her chair, the wine glass resting lightly between her fingers. The villa was silent, but inside, she could hear the echo of Michael's voice, the weight of his betrayal lingering like a shadow. She took a slow sip of wine, the liquid burning down her throat, grounding her in the reality she had just created. Whatever came next, she would be ready. She had no choice but to be. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Julia rose from her chair, smoothing down her dress one final time. The night was over. The day ahead would require careful planning, calculated movements, and a mask of normalcy she had perfected over years of living in Michael's shadow. She walked upstairs, her movements light, slipping into bed without a sound. The weight of her choices settled in, but Julia refused to let it break her. Not yet. The following morning, the villa's housekeeper arrived for her usual routine and discovered Michael unresponsive in the guest house. Emergency services were called, and initial assessments pointed to an accidental fall. Authorities noted the scene appeared undisturbed, with no immediate signs of foul play. Julia, visibly shaken, maintained that Michael had been distant and stressed in recent weeks, portraying herself as a grieving widow. However, inconsistencies in Julia's account soon caught the attention of investigators. Her timeline of events conflicted with security footage, which showed her entering and exiting the guest house late at night. Forensic teams combing through the scene found subtle but telling details, trace evidence suggesting that the scene had been tampered with and injuries that didn't align with a simple accident. Meanwhile, Francesca Moretti, upon learning of Michael's death, reportedly expressed deep regret to those close to her, fearing that the pressure she placed on him had driven him to desperation. Friends and acquaintances of the couple described their marriage as strained in the months leading up to his death, with whispers of infidelity circulating among their social circle. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the pressure on Julia mounted. She maintained a composed exterior, but those around her noticed her growing unease. The forensic report ultimately revealed that Michael's injuries were inconsistent with a fall, leading to further scrutiny. Detectives revisited her alibi and questioned staff, uncovering subtle behavioral changes in the days leading up to the incident. With mounting evidence and surveillance footage placing Julia at the guest house during critical hours, authorities had enough to move forward. Julia was taken into custody, and formal charges were filed against her. The case sent shockwaves through the local community, with media outlets closely following every development. In the end, Julia's carefully constructed life crumbled under the weight of the investigation. What began as whispers of infidelity spiraled into a tragic tale of deception, betrayal, and fatal consequences. The trial that followed painted a picture of a woman driven by anger and humiliation, leaving behind a cautionary reminder of how unchecked emotions can lead to irreversible actions. Julia was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 years.